good afternoon, everyone. It's such a delight to be here. And can I say, here's to in-person events again. Great to be here. Well, again, thank you so much, Hannah, for that kind introduction. And I will say, the previous speaker as well, there's a lot that was discussed that I'm hoping in today's conversation we can unpack as well. So once again, my name is Anjum Sultana. I'm a fellow here at the Public Policy Forum. And today, throughout the summit, we've had many incredible sessions that have spanned the gamut from innovation to advance the net zero agenda, to understanding the current geopolitical context and what that means for our country and our economy, and highlighting potential challenges on the horizon. We have learned a lot during the last 2.5 years about how our destinies, both economic and social, are intertwined, how the well-being of one affects the well-being of another, and how we need all hands on deck to meet the challenges of now, as well as the challenges of the future. So challenges currently like COVID, climate, and conflict, but also future crises that we have to be prepared for. So what comes next? I have the distinct pleasure of being on an expert advisory council of an exciting new initiative at the Public Policy Forum that seeks to answer this question, alongside PPF's TD Fellow for Economic and Financial Inclusion, Gayatri Shukla. The All-In Pathways to Economic and Financial Inclusion to Canada project will focus on understanding the structural and practical challenges and opportunities to ensuring everyone in Canada can share in our collective prosperity. As a moderator of today's session, we'll be unpacking some of those themes. And we're going to talk about how do we make the economy work for everyone. I feel very lucky to be joined on stage with folks from a variety of different sectors who are going to talk to us about how do we unlock economic opportunities for underrepresented communities? How do we ensure there's practices to have thriving workplaces that work for all of us and have seen the ripple effects of an inclusive economy in action? So without further ado, let's begin. So first, Dr. Mike Deganier. He is the CEO and president of Indspire. He's also the first president of Yukon University and was most recently the 6th president and vice chancellor of Nipissing University. He's also done incredible work as the founding executive director of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, a national organization which addressed the legacy of Indian residential schools. So, Dr. Mike Deganier, I want to start off with a striking statistic. During the pandemic, as a country, we've actually reached the highest rates of young people who are out of education, training, and employment, the highest in 2 decades. And we know that unemployment and lack of access to education and training it's not experienced the same by everyone. So I'd love to talk a bit about your organization Inspire that through the power of education really unlocks opportunities for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And it was really interesting the way your organization framed education, tying it to our collective prosperity. Indigenous education is Canada's future. So I'd love for you to tell us more about this and what have you seen that's worked well in the space of Indigenous education, and what else should we be doing to unlock economic opportunities for all?
Well, thanks very much. Yes, Inspire is an organization, and hello to everyone in person. It's nice to see everyone, so many colleagues and friends from university sector and Action Canada, part of the Public Policy Forum. There are so many things that Inspire and other organizations like ours are doing to promote Indigenous prosperity through participation in post-secondary education. But there's so much more that we can all do. My first concern is that if we focus entirely on how we move forward in the future, we might forget a little bit about the fundamentals that we have to think about in terms of promoting Indigenous prosperity and full inclusion in our economy. Things like connectivity, which I hope we talk about more and more. The idea that you may not know this, but most Indigenous communities have real struggles with connectivity. And here we are talking about prosperity and with remote work, et cetera. And remote work in many places is virtually impossible. We are, if we fast forward to some of the possibilities, we look at the university sector, we are only really coming to the end of the first generation of Indigenous young people who have been attending university. Mm-hmm. Up until about 1975, we were precluded from going to university because we had to enfranchise, we had to give up our rights as Indigenous people to attend. So why do so many of you have university degrees? Well, you probably chose that direction in life because your parents had university degrees. And so when you are just coming up to the very first generation of students who have been allowed to pursue post-secondary studies, this is a real concern. So we need to we have to focus more on our momentum for universities. Universities are creating spaces for Indigenous students, but we have to make sure that the students that are coming out of high schools today on off reserve know that those spaces are there and do a better job of us in industry and in nonprofits and in government of going to those spaces and linking our young people to universities and the possibilities of post-secondary life. So I think that momentum keeping is probably the thing that we should focus on going forward.
I really appreciate that, and I think also ensuring that we actually do take a look at the historical context and understand all of the barriers that really impact whether it's Indigenous education or education for other underrepresented communities as well. And you talked a bit about education being part of the journey. Another part of the journey is working thriving in the workplace, and how do we ensure that people have everything they need to really reach their full potential. So Angelin, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. So Angelin Soosaipillai is the Vice President of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion at Mitacs. She's responsible for leading the EDI strategy at Mitacs to support inclusive innovation in Canada. Prior to joining Mitacs, Angelin held the role of Director Consulting at the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, where she helped a wide range of employers across the country identify barriers and develop measurable strategies to advance EDI. She also holds a LLB from the University of Birmingham Law School and a BA from the University of Toronto. So we talked a bit with Dr. Deganier about how do we ensure we're creating equitable pathways to economic opportunity, and education and reskilling being part of that journey. And sometimes it's about being there earlier on in life with the right resources and support, and sometimes it's also around those inflection points in our journey as well. Now, what happens when someone lands in the workplace, especially from diverse equity-seeking groups? I'm wondering, from your experience at Mitacs and beyond, what are some of the strategies you've seen that have really ensured people can thrive in the workplace? What is working and what else is missing?
Well, we've spoken a little bit about what it takes to get into the workplace, and that in and of itself is a huge, huge undertaking to remove those barriers and get that diversity through the door. And there's a lot of focus on that. A lot of organizations are implementing targets, looking at creating pathways, looking to attract diverse candidates, and really just focusing on representation, which is a great thing. I think a lot of organizations, some of the best organizations, really think a little beyond that, and they think about inclusion. And that's a huge part of thriving in the workplace, is not just having representation, but ensuring that you have policies, programs, and a healthy workplace culture. Because naturally, when you go from having a homogenous culture to a more diverse workplace, there's more viewpoints, there's possibly more conflict, there's new challenges and issues to solve. And I think people sometimes overlook that it's really important to think about the inclusion. And it's a tougher thing to measure. It's not as simple as who's here and who's not, and how can we get the people who aren't here. It really requires a lot of learning and unlearning from everyone in the workplace. Leaders can really set the tone. So leadership themselves, some of the best organizations that I've seen in my consulting years have really started top down. And I know we're doing the same at Mitacs. We've undergone, we've had an assessment that was done on our organization. We're looking at our board, ensuring that there's representation there, committed to the 50-30 challenge. But the next phase for us really is ensuring that all of the diverse people we're bringing in to our organization can thrive. And that requires us to do things differently and having some uncomfortable conversations and really hearing from people on how they're experiencing the workplace. Because there's lots of barriers, and it requires active conversation to start to uncover those. And underrepresented groups are such a broad umbrella, and there really isn't a Band-Aid solution for everyone. But starting to look into different diversity barriers for various groups and having targeted solutions is huge. So even looking at things like workplace policies when it comes to flexibility, that can go a long way for a lot of groups. Having the option to work at different hours, having the option to work in different places, that can be pretty cross-cutting for a number of underrepresented communities. But to your earlier point, Mike, just knowing that there are additional barriers that come with that expectation of remote work, where not everyone may have access to connectivity. So you really have to link your policies back to the groups and figure out what will help whom, because it's really hard to find solutions that'll satisfy everyone. And so a lot of surveying, a lot of activities required to really understand what some of the barriers are will help people thrive. And the second point I want to make is ensuring that your external efforts really match your internal. I think there's a bit of a bait and switch sometimes with organizations who have made really great commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion. They've got the right intentions. But sometimes when underrepresented groups join an organization, they find it's not quite how it seemed on the outside. There's a little bit of work that needs to be done. So really ensuring there's consistency. So, if you're looking at your external communications and efforts and ensuring that there's good representation there, bringing that into your internal processes, ensuring that you have diverse representation in all that you do. So that it extends a little bit beyond tokenism. That would really help people thrive because they would really buy in to the mission and the mandate, and it extends beyond lip service.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. Not just diversity in the workplace, but actually inclusion is about having that sense of belonging and then validating. Understanding a one-size-fits-all approach does not work, and actually maybe there was an intervention, but let's actually check that again with the communities that it's supposed to serve. So I think that's excellent. I wanted to take this opportunity to invite Brent into the conversation as well. So Brent Chamberlain is the Associate Vice President with CIBC's Talent and Workforce Transformation Team, leading the bank's global inclusion, campus recruitment, and early career strategies. He also held previous leadership roles at several nonprofits, including Executive Director of Pride at Work, and holds degrees from the London School of Economics and McGill University. So Brent, I wanted to ask you a bit about, what we talked about a bit earlier around the ripple effects of an inclusive economy. And so, hearing from Angelin and hearing from Dr. DeGagné around, what are the opportunities around increasing representation in the workplace, but also ensuring that ability to thrive, what are the ripple effects of that? We talk a lot about the strategies to move the dial on representation, but I want to take that one step further and dig deeper around not only what does that mean around who works at an organization, but how that organization works and moves and transforms and evolves. So I'd be curious, from your vantage point in the banking and financial services sector, what have you seen as the ripple effects of an inclusive economy?
Excellent. Thank you, Anjum. And let me start by saying I'm delighted to share this stage with such a prestigious panel today. And I want to do just that. I want to build off what was shared a few moments ago. When we talk about inclusion, I'm sure many of us have an idea that pops into our head. I would say 8 out of 10 people in this audience probably first think of human capital. So the work that we do to retain, advance, and promote talent from underrepresented segments in our economy. That is part of the story. It's a very important part of the story, but it's not the whole story. There are several ways to look at inclusion, and I wanted to just share a little bit of a view of how CIBC approaches this very important subject. So, of course, we have a strategy focused on inclusive talent management that does those very important human capital pieces that I was just mentioning. We also have a very big focus on inclusive leadership. Inclusive leadership is the practice of understanding people's unique differences and really trying to lean in to promote a greater sense of belonging. Now, the third part, most interesting part where we start to come in is the inclusive banking aspect of our approach. And this is really looking at embedding inclusion into the way that we do business, into our very DNA and our commercial activities. And I actually think that this is the part of the conversation that's often left off the table. And considering the subject of today's panel, I actually think it's the most important part of driving forward an inclusive economy in this country. So what do I mean when I say inclusive banking or looking at inclusion in the way we do business? that is the question that I would ask to each and every one of you in the room today, that how would you look at your strategy differently if doing good and doing well were actually not looked at as different goals, if they were the same thing? And you can imagine for the financial services industry, that's a pretty big question, and it's a very important question. I think it's probably the question that most defines our time. When we look at that at CIBC, we're really driving into understanding the unique needs of our clients, what we need to do to remove barriers to financial inclusion, historic barriers that have existed over many, many, many decades. And through this, we actually come back to the first part of the conversation, which is around human capital. If we get this right, if we remove those barriers, if we engage a larger part of the community in a conversation about what it means to truly drive an inclusive economy forward, we will be better at attracting a wider talent pool. That means that we will increase the share of underrepresented talent in our workforce. We will work to create that sense of belonging, and that will then drive forward, again, a conversation around inclusive economic growth. So I would encourage people not to look at it as a sequential journey, right? You kind of start with human capital, you build to leadership, and then you look at how this applies to your stakeholders. I would say it's a holistic journey. Look at this together, all in at the same time, again, referencing the subject of the panel. And the last thing I'll say is, if you think that the questions that I've posed don't apply to you, you're wrong. They apply to each and every one of the people in this room today. I was really excited last night to join a dinner that was hosted by KPMG, where we were talking about infrastructure financing for Indigenous communities. And I think we did just that, and Mike was there as well. We talked about how do we use inclusive design to flip the script, to change the conversation around not how do we spend more money in Indigenous communities, but actually where's the opportunity? What our opportunity is in the North, and how do we actually transform the conversation to be a positive one? That will bring the financial services to the table. That will bring the policymakers to the table. And no matter what you do, whether it's human resources or you design medical devices, you have a duty to ask yourself a question: where is unconscious bias showing up in my industry? What am I doing to include other stakeholders whose voices perhaps may not have been included in the table before? That is our role as leaders in 2022, and I'm very proud to work for an organization that takes that so close to heart, and I'm very proud to share a stage today with 4 leaders who also are engaging in that same conversation.
That's great, Brent. And I think really that reframing to an asset-based approach around what is being already at the table and starting from that spot. So the next question that I have, and is for all of you, I'll start with you, Brent, first, and it's around, what needs to be on our collective radar as a society when it comes to inclusive economies. And, the COVID-19 pandemic is this once-in-a-century crisis that really impacted us on a personal level, but also on a population level. It was something that was a health crisis, it was an economic crisis, it was a social crisis, it was a policy crisis. But in many ways, it was a precursor, a dress rehearsal to perhaps future crises that are around the corner, from climate change to humanitarian emergencies to cybersecurity, which is something we heard a bit about earlier today, and more. And the threats aren't in short supply, but frankly, and thank goodness, neither are the solutions. There's so many around the table as well. So for each of you, from your specific vantage point, what is something we should all keep on our collective radar when it comes to an inclusive economy, and what gives you hope? What is something that you would really encourage all of us to keep our attention on? So we'll start with you, Brent.
Perfect, thank you. And I probably took too long to answer the first question, so I'll keep it short. The thing that gives me the most hope today is that people are listening. That isn't always been the case. And it sounds really simple, maybe overly simple. And a lot of people ask the question, how do you define inclusive leadership? There's a lot of ways to define it. But the most simple, and I think the most true, is it's simply the act of listening. Listening to others, understanding their stories, understanding where they came from and how they got there, how their experience is different from your own, and what you can do to learn from their experiences and embed that into your strategy, whatever that is, public policy, financial, into the financial industry, et cetera. And, you know, in today's society, I mean, we are very busy, we're very tech-enabled, but there are pockets that are emerging where you really do see that inclusive leadership in action. You know, I'm delighted that, you know, one of our core practices at CIBC is to listen. You know, I think about how we reacted after George Floyd was murdered. There was a lot of ways to react. We reacted by listening, by pulling together team members from the Black community at CIBC and listening to their stories. And, you know, the time that our senior leadership team took to just sit down and hear people's stories, understand what that means, what that meant to them, how we can use those experiences and embed them into our own practices, to your point, in terms of what that looks like to create an inclusive workplace. I would encourage everyone to do that, right? You know, this concept of inclusion, EDI, right, all the acronyms that are thrown out there, it can be bewildering, but don't let it get you confused. Just start by listening. You likely have the experts in your own organization already. Have you taken the time to speak with them, to understand their points of view? And if you don't, go out and find them, right? Go out and talk to those stakeholders. They could be clients, they could be community members, et cetera. There are fairly easy steps to take, and I actually think that I've seen a lot of that. So it gives me hope, and I think it's a trend that's worth developing.
Okay. Thank you, Brent. Angelin, over to you.
Yeah, I think I'm glad people are listening. I'm glad that people are just, there's a heightened awareness that I feel didn't exist 2 years ago when it comes to a lot of socioeconomic and societal issues around inequity. People are using very advanced terminology like systemic barriers. Like, I didn't hear that 2.5 years ago. When I was consulting, people talked about unconscious bias, and language has evolved. I think our collective awareness has evolved, and I think during the pandemic, people have paused and really started to understand a bit more than we had for a while. And so I think that heightened awareness, coupled with empathy, could take us to really great places. And I think, you know, there's something known as empathy fatigue when there's all of these horrible things happening around the world and we're all digesting it, and it becomes a lot, right? You kind of max out and you can't keep taking it all in. I'm optimistic that the world is reopening. Here, we're all here. I'm wearing shoes at a panel. That's like the highlight of my speaking engagements in the last 2 years. I had to put shoes on. And I think that creates empathy. People start to connect again, and now we can couple that awareness that we all have built in the last 2 years with human connection, and we can put that into decision making, right? We can take it places. I think we need to be thinking about equity in all that we do. In terms of recovering our economy. There's barriers all over the place. I think we've all become aware of a lot of them. And so that awareness and that empathy, I think, is what gives me hope that we can have an inclusive recovery for all.
And how about you?
Well, I think from an Indigenous perspective, you know, this is an excellent sort of window of time. The window is open, right? And we can make some change. And I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how it has promoted the 94 calls to action. I mean, I'm sure everybody in this room knows this. If you're here at a public policy forum, chances are you've read the 94 calls to action. And we've all sort of found our place in there, right? You know, whatever sector you're from, you find that you're number 47 or whatever it is, and you think, you know, we're going to get behind this, we're going to promote this. And so all of that is good, and all of that is hopeful. I think where our challenge is to uncouple some of our actions from our preconceptions, misconceptions about Indigenous people. And so to start to see Indigenous people in a different way. You see this a lot in, let's say, the university sector, just to refer to a group that I've recently worked with. And there's a sense that every single Indigenous person that comes through the door needs some sort of remedial help. So you can find hundreds of those types of programs in our colleges and our universities and our training schools, remedial help for Indigenous people to get them up to a place where we can begin to train them to, really engage with Canadian economy. But try and find a program that celebrates the excellence of Indigenous people, those that are high achievers and are moving beyond expectation, and they are there. They are there. So we've got to see Indigenous people as they come through the door as an opportunity for us to, as a partner to work with, not necessarily always as someone you have to help. Perhaps it's someone that you have to lift up and celebrate in terms of their excellence. So I think this is a great time, obviously a great time to be optimistic, but at the same time, a time when we can challenge our own biases and preconceptions a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think each of you talked in many ways around that knowledge piece. There's greater awareness in many ways, perhaps with the pandemic and just what has been happening in society. The field has been prepared for ideas to be seeded, for action to be taken. And I'm wondering, one of the questions in the audience is, after bringing voices to the table, first of all, what are diverse voices saying, and what are some of the steps that are being taken to act on what they're saying? So this is open to anyone, but really, how do we start to move from knowledge and awareness to action that makes a difference?
Well, I'll start, and it's, what are diverse voices saying? Remember, diverse voices saying are diverse things, right? So there's,
Absolutely.
so the person that you see at your table that is supposed to be the inclusivity person, and they have a point of view. They're not representing all of the people who need to be represented and all of the voices and conversations. So diverse people say diverse things. So you've got to really carefully curate and manage the kinds of advice you're getting, which means you can't just go to that one employee who happens to be from, South Asia and say, so what do you people think? You've got to broaden it and try to understand that there's a lot of opinions out there, and you've got to make the effort to talk to different people about the same subject.
That's great.
Yeah, well put. I mean, I think any policy, any process that needs to be changed, if you get diverse people at the table, you'll probably never reach consensus on what that policy should actually look like. Because it's hard to satisfy everyone's needs in one policy or in one initiative. So I think it needs to be iterative. I think people try to get to perfection, and it stops us from even trying because it's just too daunting. So bite-sized chunks, even if it means prioritizing diversity demographics, to say, okay, this year we're going to focus on these 2 or 3 groups because we recognize that they're, the most underrepresented in our workplace, or whatever the rationale may be, and just start there. Keep it simple. And I think EDI is a journey and not a destination. So it takes time, and I think people have good intentions and just want to get going, but sometimes I think a slower start will lead to better outcomes.
I mean, I think it's been covered very well. Maybe I'll add a slightly different perspective to the topic. So I would say, what I've seen is that people are speaking up in general. And I'll use a really inane example here, but a lot of organizations collect demographic data, segmentation data on their employee population, both at application stage and on the workforce themselves. It's not too long ago that people would write into anonymous mailbox saying, how very dare you ask me that question? You're my employer, you have no right to know my ethnicity or my sexual orientation or even my gender. I've seen that conversation evolve. Those voices are certainly still there, but we also, that chorus has been joined by another group of voices who say, when they're applying to a job and they don't see that potential employer asking those questions, why aren't you asking? Because if you do not ask this data, you can't possibly know if your application pool represents Canada's labor market. If the people who you choose to interview from your applicant pool represent the actual full applicant pool, or if you're weeding people out inadvertently. And so I think that the conversation has moved on to a place where it's less of why are you asking and a little bit more of okay, now we understand why it's important to speak up, to be counted in. And that's really important. I think more organizations need to do that. Certainly the financial sector that is legislated under the Employment Equity Act have been doing that for a number of years, but I've seen a lot of other organizations start to do that. It was a big part of our partnership with the Black North Initiative when it was first launched, and we helped to create the CEO Pledge. You'll see if you've read the CEO Pledge that collecting demographic data is a fundamental part of that, right? You need to understand not just the percentage of your population, your employee population that identifies as a visible minority, to use the legislative language, but also those who identify as South Asian, identify as members of the Black community, et cetera, because there are differences within that group as well, right? Unfortunately, sometimes these umbrella categories very much hide real unevenness, so to speak, underneath that. And that certainly goes for Indigenous peoples as well. So I think that we've evolved in our conversation quite a bit as a country. I'm happy to see that policy is helping to drive that. Employers are getting out there. They're seeing the benefit of being able to do that kind of analytics. And we're in a very different place in 2022 than we were in 2002.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting about what you shared also is that idea of both hearts and minds, changing hearts and minds and changing our actions, but also changing the way we think about issues. And I'm wondering, as perhaps like the last question, what is one thing that you would see would be helpful to continuing to change hearts and minds when it comes to inclusive innovation and inclusive economies? Is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with that you'd love for them to push around changing hearts and minds? This time I might go to Angelin, and then Mike, and then Brent.
Yeah, I think hearts and minds, I'll keep it simple. Data for minds, people who need to see numbers, people who need to see stats, and for those who are maybe more easily convinced via heart, storytelling and empathy. I think storytelling breeds empathy, and whichever way you're swayed, for some it's both. I think those are very powerful tools in the world of EDI.
Role models. I think that's, the role model programs for a variety of different populations has been around a long time, but I think they still work. I think we still, and maybe not just for the populations themselves, but for others to see, the possibilities and what excellence looks like in our community. So, role models.
Well, I already said listening, so I can't say that again. I'll say another simple concept, lending privilege. It's really important that those of us who have privilege recognize that and use it to help the next generation of leaders and change makers. Very simple. Doesn't take much. It's inviting someone to a meeting. It's giving someone a voice. It's amplifying their opinion to make sure that it is in fact heard and attributed to them. Simple steps, but they're very impactful.
Well, thank you all. I think that's the perfect note to end on around how do we actually give up space, but also take these conversations ahead. So with that, I'd love to thank all of you and thank the audience for those great questions, and looking forward to continuing later tonight at the dinner. Thank you again.